August 18th, 1952. The outpost war continues this week and continues to be bloody in the Battle of Bunker Hill. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, there was a South Korean presidential election. There was pretty serious fighting in the field for an outpost known as Siberia to the U.S. Marines, and the ROK Capital Division saw its own heavy action further east. I did say that as last week ended, the Marines launched a diversionary attack on Siberia, realizing that to hold it, they'd have to take another position first. Elements of U.S. 1st Marine Division attack Hill 122, known as Bunker Hill, to the Marines as this week begins. This position dominates the enemy positions on Hill 58, aka Siberia, positions the Chinese drove the Marines from last week. The Marine attacks on Bunker Hill actually begin already late the 11th, the last day of last week. The assault force for this is Company B from the 1st Battalion of the 1st Marine Regiment, but is operationally controlled by Roy Batterton's 2nd Battalion. They managed to reach the crest of the hill by 10:30 that evening, bypassing pockets of Chinese troops en route and then going back afterwards and clearing them off of the near slope. Those pockets cannot stop the Marine tide, and behind the assault force, Korean Service Corps personnel and more Marines bring things like sandbags, shovels, and wire up to prepare for the inevitable Chinese counterattack. This does not come until mid-afternoon the 12th, though the Marines are hit by enemy mortar fire in the morning. By then, Company B is under 3rd Battalion's operational control, and Lieutenant Colonel Gerard Armitage is now responsible for Bunker Hill's defense. His Company I reinforces, and they fight off 350 or so Chinese and manage to hold the southern slope of the hill. Marine reserves begin coming in, and by day's end, the 3rd Battalion from the 7th Marines is also under Armitage's operational control. There's actually a bunch of shuffling and moving around of companies and battalions, and yes, it is confusing. But it's kind of necessary since the 1st Marine Division is spread pretty thin over an extended front. They are fairly certain the Chinese will attack again that night, but the Chinese steal a page from the Marines' playbook and launch a diversion like the Marines did last week. Just before midnight, they launched 3 probing attacks, one of them harassing an outpost east of Bunker Hill, one of them managing to run into an ambush set by the Korean Marines, and the third, the strongest one, hitting a U.S. Marine position they call Stromboli, 4 kilometers northeast of Bunker Hill, near the boundary between the 1st and 5th Marine Regiments. There, they do enough damage that the Marines have to call in reinforcements. The first unit sent up from the main line of resistance is driven back, but eventually enough units are sent in to break up the Chinese encirclement of Stromboli. But that is, again, a diversion. And that night, the Chinese also do attack Bunker Hill, starting with an artillery barrage around 1 a.m. The Chinese infantry then comes in, and 4 hours of bloody close combat follows, until the Chinese pressure slowly eases. When the Marines manage to bring in reinforcements, the Chinese withdraw from Bunker Hill. They do not forget about it, though. And on the 13th, after yet another diversion, one against Combat Outpost 2, which overlooks the Panmunjom corridor, they hit Bunker Hill with a battalion at 9 p.m. But the Marines box themselves in with illumination and high explosive cells and manage to take out the few Chinese who do break through. That same Chinese battalion attacks again around 2:30 a.m., backed by a machine gun firing from Siberia, but the Marines light that up and take it out, and the attack again fails. After all this action over just a few days, the Marines reinforce not just Bunker Hill, but this whole section of the Jamestown line, which they now call the Siberia sector. There's another Chinese attack at 1:15 the 15th, but the Marines use tanks with shuttered searchlights to target them with light blasts, and they stall the first Chinese push. And the fighting that night ends around 4 when the Chinese pull back. The hill is then quiet for 12 hours, except for a thunderstorm. Then the Chinese attack at 4 that afternoon while it is still raining heavily, not using any artillery to hopefully achieve surprise, but still failing in their attack. After midnight, they attack yet again, actually reaching the crest, but are driven back. They seem to really want this position, though it's quiet there today at least. Over in the 5th Marine Sector, where the Chinese occupied 2 of 3 outposts in front of 2nd Battalion last week, they managed to take the 3rd one, Outpost Irene, on the 17th, and they fight off a strong Marine attempt to take it back. Here's something more about the Marines, specifically Marine artillery. On the 13th, the new coordination scheme of artillery and airstrikes begins really showing results. Marine planes fly 124 sorties, and none are hit by the enemy. Under the new Standard Operating Procedure, SOP, artillery strikes enemy artillery positions in conjunction with the friendly airstrikes, thereby impeding enemy reaction fire. The practice is soon adopted by the other services. This was the brainchild of Marine General Frank Lamson Scribner, who just noted recently that there were no artillery strikes during an airstrike and figured, hey, why not have artillery flak suppression fire during the actual strike? Marine plane losses reached a peak in June. After this, they will never approach it again. And something an awful lot of people are worried they'll never approach again is an armistice agreement at the Panmunjom peace talks. Although many plans were proffered and alternate approaches were advanced during the summer by individuals and nations for ending the Korean War, none of the proposals presented an answer that would satisfy both sides, and none could as long as they remained diametrically opposed in their principles. What then remained to be done? In Munsan-ni, Tokyo, and Washington, this question was accorded mounting attention during the waning weeks of the summer. There are but 4 plenary meetings at Panmunjom this month, on the 2nd, the 10th, today the 18th, with the last to come on the 26th. At these meetings, there's anger and name-calling from the communist side, and on the UN side, there is Chief Delegate William Harrison trying to somehow drive a wedge between the Chinese and the North Koreans by pointing out the priority and importance given to the Chinese POWs compared to the almost casual way the future of the North Korean POWs is being handled, but not much else. It is the UN that has spaced these meetings at 8-day intervals, and the UN that makes zero effort to introduce anything new. This is to really try to drive home that their stand is firm and their last offer really is their final offer. At the same time, the summer bombing campaign of North Korea continues, but only routine publicity was given to the airstrikes, and they were justified on military grounds alone. The U.S. leaders did not wish to engage communist prestige so seriously that agreement to an armistice might be further delayed. But there is still fighting all the while. Now, I've talked fairly recently about the problems of a limited war and about the frustration that people, especially in the U.S., have by now. It cannot help but affect domestic affairs. See, when the objective of the war was military victory, people were mostly okay with the expenditure of American money and lives. But with the decision to negotiate the end of the war and the failure to reach an agreement, there's a lot of criticism of the war this summer, because a lot of people think the war has already served its purpose. The North Koreans have been pushed back beyond the 38th parallel where they began, and the communist world knows for certain that the U.S. will fight against outright communist aggression. The U.S. and its allies also now know not to underestimate communist Chinese military strength. And the only thing standing in the way of an armistice is the POW reparation issue. It just seems to me, and it will become more obvious one way or another over the next few months, that the Korean issue will be the main issue of the U.S. presidential campaigns this fall. It's not like the debates are going to have an effect on the actual war, right? But that's the backdrop. And the Republican and Democratic candidates, Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson, have made peace in Korea the center of their platforms. The slackening of interest in military victory and the avowed intentions of both political parties to make an end of the Korean commitment meant that requests for additional manpower, expenditures, and resources would be closely scanned by both the executive and the legislative branch. In view of the election year atmosphere that fostered criticism of the administration's policies and the possibility of which the Army was well aware that there might be a change in the direction of the war if the Republicans proved victorious, mid-1952 was characterized by caution. So, limited war it remains. And of course, there's the bigger picture, as I've mentioned before. If the communists refuse to continue the truce talks at some point, military pressure might need to increase. But that's the real weakness. The US doesn't have enough military strength to militarily force the communists to accept the UNC armistice on its terms without leaving Europe and the US itself unacceptably exposed. Sure, the US has atomic weapons, and that is pretty major force, but using them in North Korea, a rocky, mountainous country that doesn't have a whole lot of worthwhile targets. That, of course, is leaving aside the moral issues that haven't been settled, whether the U.S. should use atomic weapons when it's not been directly attacked, or against a nation that is actively engaged in peace negotiations, or just using them ever in general at all. So the current U.S. position in Korea here in the summer of 1952 is pretty much a gamble. A gamble that the Chinese do want peace, and that the limited pressure the UN forces can apply will help secure that peace. And all the while, waiting for that to happen, the ROK and Japanese forces are being built up to the hopeful point that they'll be able to handle the communist menace by themselves. That is sort of an insurance policy the US has taken out against being in a war without end, that eventually, armistice or no armistice, non-Korean forces would be withdrawn from the Korean Peninsula. The candidates for the U.S. presidential election, once again, Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson, were chosen at the party conventions last month. Now, how is it going for them? Well, Stevenson has to contend with President Harry Truman's unpopularity. They're both Democrats, as well as recent scandals within the party. Stevenson could not shake off his party's recent past, and he found himself contesting several Republican campaigns. One was organized by Senator Carl Mundt's formula, K1C3, Korea, crime, communism, and corruption. Another was Eisenhower, who heard the chant, "We like Ike," wherever he went. Eisenhower happily stayed on the high perch, while Joe McCarthy and Richard Nixon exploited the treason in high places theme, the latter saying a Stevenson victory would mean more Alger hisses, more atomic spies, more crises. As for World War II hero Eisenhower, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper writes, "Millions were happy to take him on faith, on his smile, on the image of American manhood, on the happy virtue of his family life." Okay, that may be true, but Joseph Golden writes, "Still, the Eisenhower campaign seemed to lack the vital spark that would ensure victory. Stevenson's soaring eloquence impressed television audiences, and although Eisenhower commanded the editorial support of much of the nation's press, American intellectuals backed the man called an egghead." That's Stevenson. Eisenhower has so far also kept Korea out of things in these past weeks of the campaign. You can kind of see why. I mean, he's a professional soldier. Well, to many people, he is the professional soldier. He is loath to say anything that might actually harm his old comrades and his colleagues who are currently running the Korean War. But he's going to have to talk about it at some point and not leave it to his running mate, Richard Nixon, who, while he did serve in the U.S. Navy in World War II, is not a military man like Dwight Eisenhower. Just about nobody is a military man like Dwight Eisenhower. Well, I'll keep you posted with dispatches about all of this in future, but I am now finished with my coverage of this week of the war, with new Marine artillery coordination and the battle for Bunker Hill, which is not a big place, but which a lot of people on both sides die for, or get injured for, get scarred mentally and physically for. We really saw it beginning last year at Heartbreak Ridge and Bloody Ridge, heavy, close fighting to take one terrain feature. And then the soldier or the Marine looks north or south from that terrain feature and sees hundreds more similar terrain features and realizes that he, or someone like him, very well might be asked to die for one of those terrain features in this limited war. One of those terrain features that doesn't even have a name. However that happens, if it happens, and however the war ends up going, I will be here to cover it week after week after week, and that is thanks to the Time Ghost Army. That's what allows me to shine a light on overlooked or forgotten parts of our history. You too can join the Army at timegoes.com or timegoes.tv or patreon.com. That's what it is. I've said it enough times. I should get it in my head, right? These are the newest commissioned Army officers, and Lee Smith is the Army Member of the Week here. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.